Hi, my name is Diana Isaacs, and today I'm going to present using data as a conversation tool to optimize care. I'm an endocrinology clinical pharmacy specialist and also the CGM program coordinator at the Cleveland Clinic Diabetes Center. By the end of the presentation, I hope that you'll be able to individualize technology options in diabetes care, identify potential barriers to diabetes data download and management, but we're also going to talk about ways to overcome that. We're going to review the CGM key metrics and reporting options to figure out what may work best in our patient care. And then I'm going to describe the data model that's actually really great for glucose data discussion and helps with clinical management. I want to share this diagram. It's called the ICC framework. This is actually from a new paper that is in the Diabetes Educator in the August 2020 issue. And this is really where we try to get the right technology for the right person at the right time with the right education. And we do it by identifying what that right technology is, helping to configure that based on user preferences and providing ongoing support. And then we're collaborating with data-driven conversations, shared decision-making, and care team integration. I can't emphasize enough that people with diabetes deserve a choice. There is not a one-size-fits-all. I'm a big advocate of diabetes technology simply because I see how much it helps people. But that being said, there's a different technology option that may work best for an individual person. And my goal is to make people aware of what options they have so that they can make an informed decision about what that best option for them is going to be. So speaking of trying to pick out the right technology, how do you go about doing it? Well, certainly, the representatives from the various industry companies have a lot of information. I really think it's great to go to nonprofit websites, and I listed an example here, like diabeteswise.org, to get what's hopefully a less biased viewpoint in just information, objective information about what each type of system can and can't do, whether we're talking about continuous glucose monitors, insulin pumps, smart pens, or data platforms. In addition to that, I think utilizing the diabetes educator, or now called the diabetes care and education specialist, who's hopefully well informed of all the options, is great to come up with what is going to work best for a person's specific lifestyle. But I really believe that people should know what all their options are instead of just, going with the one that their provider or team just happens to be most familiar with. We do know that there can be some clinician barriers to data download. So one of the great things about technology is it allows so much data at our fingertips, right? All the insulin pump, the CGM, the glucose, combining it with the number of steps and activity minutes and food logs and even pictures of food. I find it to be really exciting. But it can be a little bit overwhelming, and we know that. One of the issues is each respective system seems to have their own data platform. And so that can be challenging when you think about, passwords and logging into the systems and if they're not directly communicating to each other. We also know that many of the systems, if you have like a reader or a receiver or with certain insulin pumps, need to be plugged in through that USB cord. I am very happy to say that now we're getting toward more mobile apps with Bluetooth technology where that data can be downloaded much more efficiently. The next thing, though, is there's a lot of different reporting options. And does anybody have time to be sifting through 30 pages of data? Many times it's just a different way of showing the same thing. And so that's an area where we've got to simplify it, right? And fortunately, some systems are going to like just one page concise AGP report to see all the CGM data, and that's great instead of scrolling through all the different pages. But the next thing is, do clinicians know what to do with the data? And that's where I think definitely having some education so that they know what to quickly look at can be very helpful. And to just further illustrate this point, I've taken basically Dexcom Clarity which downloads Dexcom data, Gluco, which can actually download many different insulin pumps and CGM data, and then LibreView, which downloads Libre data, and just kind of went to the default settings. And if you click on all the different reports, you can get anywhere from 16 days, 27 days for a 2-week report, and then LibreView, if you leave it on the default of the 3 weeks, you can actually get 35 pages. So obviously nobody should be just clicking everything, because who has time to be looking at all of this? So that's where going through and figuring out what makes the most sense for you and your practice, if you do that up front, you can save those settings so you're not having to look through so many pages of information. In addition to that, another tip that I have is about time in range. So time in range has kind of exploded to where it's one of the first things that we're looking at when we look at glucose data. In time in range, according to the International Consensus Report that came out in 2019, that time in range should be 70 to 180. Now, this doesn't necessarily replace preprandial and postprandial glucose targets. If you're following, the American Diabetes Association recommendations, for most people, we're aiming for 80 to 130 fasting or preprandial, and less than 180, 1 to 2 hours postprandial, peak postprandial. But in addition to that, we're looking at this time in range, trying to stay above 70, right? Because under 70 is hypoglycemia, and then trying to stay under 180 because over 180 is higher than the peak postprandial should be. What happens though is sometimes people set the reports for different numbers. And I included an example here on the top where it's set for 70 to 130. So why is that a problem? Because when you look at these statistics, this time in range, it looks like the person's only spending 31% time in range, which is lower than we want it to be. In general, we want for most people to be spending 70%, and for people at higher risk to be spending around 50% or more. But look, when you change it to the proper 70 to 180, it turns out this person is actually spending 65% time in range. So I would urge you, always double check this on the reports, because sometimes you'll be very surprised what you see. We also know, with CGM devices, there can for sure be some challenges with the alarms. Overall, alarms are an amazing thing. They can save people's lives. They can alert a person before they have life-threatening hypoglycemia. They can alert a person for hyperglycemia so that they can take action before it goes even higher. The problem is many times people don't really have these set optimally. Either they haven't met with someone or they haven't been individualized for their needs. This can lead to lots of problems. This can lead to annoyance, not paying attention to the alarms anymore because they essentially become meaningless if they're just going off all the time. Partners can get annoyed with it. And so it's really important to go through all of the alerts and figure out what's going to make the most sense for the individual person. Do they want to know at 70? Maybe they want to know even sooner. Some people want to know at 80 or 90 if they're going low. Same thing for that high alert. Some people want to know, right at 200 versus others would let it ride to 300, and some even turn it off because it is just too much. Additionally, there's the snooze alerts or the repeat alerts where, if you're low for a certain amount of time, once you want to know that you're still low, right? So you generally want to have those repeat alerts on, for low for 15 to 30 minutes, and the high should be spaced a little further out because we know a high glucose does take some time to come down. So you may want to look at 90 minutes or even 2 hours so it doesn't become really bothersome. The power of apps. So this is where really technology is moving and is getting pretty exciting, because these apps allow devices to be automatically linked to our clinic systems. So we're not having to take the USB cord and plug it in. And this has been really incredible in the era of COVID to allow us to optimize telehealth, where really, we have all the data linked up to our system because it's communicating through the app, and I can see everything and have a very meaningful telehealth visit. So I've listed some examples here. Now we've got Omnipod and Tandem insulin pumps that can automatically upload this data. And then of course we have different, CGM systems have the ability to automatically upload that data to make it really convenient to be able to view. With CGM, one of the best things about it is there are trend arrows. So we know one of the big limitations with fingerstick data is it's just one point in time. So it doesn't tell you if you're 100 and dropping, you're 100 and rising, or you're 100 and steady. And you're just supposed to say, okay, I'm 100 and then go drive a car. So having that CGM and the power of the arrows is huge. It also requires some education about whatever the person's respective system is, and then what that arrow means. And I think taking it a step further to say, okay, if double arrows up mean that your glucose is rising by more than 3 points per minute, in 30 minutes, it's going to be at least 90 points higher. And you can use that to really make informed decisions, whether that's adding extra insulin, subtracting extra insulin, waiting a little bit to get into that and to drive that car. It's very, very helpful. And this shows about that taking action on those glucose levels. So, for example, the 108 here and going down, that's decreasing. And so a person can actually do something about that before they actually experience hypoglycemia. But one of the things I've seen in practice is that people are looking at the numbers, but not paying attention to the arrows. I recently met with a patient and he was like, oh, that's what that little pointy thing means. So we need to do a better job of educating our patients about that information so that they can take action on it. We also see that sometimes people take too much action on this. They overtreat their highs and lows. And what this sometimes can look like is this image on the right where, a person's running high, they get frustrated. They don't want to stay high. And so they give themselves insulin. They're still high. So maybe they give themselves a little bit more insulin, a little bit more, and then it comes crashing down. And then ultimately what happens is that doesn't feel very good. And then they treat the hypoglycemia probably a little too much, and then it goes back high again. So there's definitely some education about what is the best way to treat hypoglycemia and hyperglycemia. And some of our knowledge of this is even changing now with hybrid closed loop insulin pumps, where it can back off the insulin in response to those CGM readings. So sometimes even those 15 grams of carbohydrates, which used to be our standard that we would recommend to people, in some cases ends up really being too much. Now let's go ahead and talk about what it means. When we go ahead and download the data and we have all that in front of us, what do we do with it? So this is one of my favorite slides. This comes from Adam Brown from Diatribe, and he talks about how there's at least 42 factors that affect glucose levels. And I love this because it shows you some of these factors are not so predictable. Different people can have different responses. And one of the classic examples is coffee. Black coffee, no milk, no sugar, nothing in it, causes some people's glucose to rise a lot. I mean, I have a patient that needs to bolus 10 units of insulin for black coffee, and then other people have no response at all. But how would you know this unless you're wearing, a CGM or you're doing a finger stick every minute, right? So that's the power of the CGM and having all that information, is to know how you, as an individual, respond to different factors. Other examples are activity, exercise. We know, light exercise for some people doesn't really affect them, like a walk. Other people, it causes them to go way down. Some of it depends on a person's fitness level. High intensity exercise can be very unpredictable in terms of whether it spikes someone up or it causes them to drop. But knowing how a person individually responds and having that data is very, very helpful. This is that time and range, that international consensus report I was talking about. And I find this very useful to have handy as I'm reviewing data to see is a person meeting their metrics. Some of the reports even have this embedded, so you don't have to kind of toggle between your reference or keep your international consensus report, carry it around all the time. But this is very helpful to see, is the person meeting the target? Are they 70% time in range? Are they less than 4% time in hypoglycemia, and then spending less than 25% above 180. And there's also guidance for pregnancy as well. And you'll notice pregnancy is the only time where that time in range is adjusted. And instead of it being 70 to 180, that is where it is 63 to 140. Now, I find that some of the reports don't let you go to exactly 63. So what I'll do is I'll make it 60 to 140. But it is important that you change the target range in pregnancy, because you don't want to be looking at the 70 to 180 when it's really important in pregnancy to be within that range of the 63 to 140. And I also want to preface it that technically none of the CGMs are FDA approved, at least not in the United States, for pregnancy. That being said, of course we use them, but this time in range does not replace the postprandial and the fasting glucose targets. So we do really need to strive for that kind of that fasting 60 to 95, and then that peak, that 1 hour postprandial under 140, and then the 2 hour being under 120. So time in range, where does it come from? Well, we've done some correlation studies, and really what we found is that 70% measured time in range is very close to around a 7% A1C. Now, you'll notice the confidence interval does span out a little wider, so it's not a guarantee that a person's A1C will be 7%, but it means that there's a pretty good chance it will be pretty close to there without having a ton of glycemic variability. Similarly, the 50% time in range correlates with an A1C of around 7.9. Which makes sense because, many of our older adults or people at higher risk of hypoglycemia, we're aiming for an adjusted A1C target of more around 8%. So what are the CGM key metrics that we're looking at? Well, we talked about time in range. In addition to that time in range, we have that percentage of the time in hypoglycemia and in hyperglycemia. But we also have a few new terms. So we have the ambulatory glucose profile, or AGP, as a way to visualize the data. The glycemic variability is a key one, and that is essentially the mean divided by the standard, or the standard deviation divided by the mean. And the target is to be less than 36%. Some would prefer it to be even under 33%. But what this means is that there's not a ton of variability between the high and low glucose levels, that it's more kind of a flatter type of curve. The other key thing on here is the data sufficiency. So generally you want to have about 70% data over a 14-day period. Now, what if you don't have all that data? Well, that's okay. You can still have a very meaningful conversation with the person with diabetes. But what it means is some of these metrics, like time in range, glycemic variability, you are missing some of the data. So they may not be quite as accurate. Another one that may not be quite as accurate is the GMI, or the glucose management indicator, which is essentially an estimated A1C. And you can imagine, if you're missing half of your data, that may not be quite spot on if you're trying to estimate the A1C from that information. So I want to introduce to you a method to review and discuss data with the person with diabetes. And this was also recently published in the Diabetes Educator in a paper called Technology Integration, the Role of the Diabetes Care and Education Specialist in Practice. And what this does is it's a 5-step process to first download the data. And in doing that, you go through what those key metrics are, and you introduce the person really to time in range and things like that if they're not already familiar with it. And you ask them, what they've learned from wearing the device so far and what their thoughts are. The next key to this is about assessing safety. And the reason why is because we know hypoglycemia, can certainly be life-threatening. And also we find that lows frequently lead to rebound highs. And so that's something you definitely want to address. But then the key is, after that, time in range and focusing on the positive on the days or the times where time in range is highest. And I think this is a slightly different approach because many clinicians are really trained to hone in on what's not working well, on the areas where maybe there are a lot of spikes and there are a lot of problems, and we want to fix that because we're supposed to help fix our patients, right? But instead, this is focusing on what's working well, having an interactive discussion about that and trying to replicate what's working well instead of focusing on what's not working well. After that, after you've focused on all the things working well, if there's still time, if the person still wants to, that's when you can look at some of the areas to improve, maybe the hyperglycemia or times of more glycemic variability, and have an interactive discussion about that. And then you take all those pieces together and you come up with collaboratively with an action plan. I do want to stress that data is data and numbers are numbers, and none of it is good or bad. How many times have you heard a patient say, oh, I know my numbers are so bad this time, or my A1C is so bad, or is my A1C good? No, 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 no. It's just information. It's not considered good or bad. And we really want to take those judgments out of our vocabulary and just have an objective discussion about the information, see what we can learn from it to help keep someone in range more and just feel their best and have the best clinical outcomes as possible. So I want to share with you a few different reports and kind of my approach to looking at it. This is called the spaghetti report. And one of the things I like about the spaghetti report, as opposed to an ambulatory glucose profile, is just that you see all the days on top of each other. And so an AGP typically will show you the 10th to the 90th percentile of data, or sometimes the 5th to the 95th, but you're still missing some of that outer data. The idea is to find the patterns. Sometimes though, you may miss the extreme episodes of hypo or hyperglycemia. And that's where a spaghetti graph can be really useful. And I can see in here that for sure there are some times where there are episodes of hypoglycemia. And so I can be able to address that through looking at this visualization. This type of report is taken from Medtronic, and this is their version of an AGP. So, we can see in there, looking at the outer data, the 25th to the 75th percentile versus the kind of the 10th to the 90th percentile. And one of the nice features of this particular report is just that they try to guide you toward where there may be some hypoglycemic patterns and then where there are hyperglycemic patterns. So any tools that we have where there's automation, where the report can guide you and say, okay, well, whether it's this day had the highest time in range, or these are the areas where there's hypoglycemia, that can sure be helpful when you're analyzing the data. This is an example from Tidepool, and this is really how their AGP report looks, with the green line being that median line, and then you can see the outer shaded areas showing where there's more variability at each specific time of the day. So this is kind of a good example how the median is totally flat, but then we can see that there's actually a lot of different variability happening depending on the time of the day. And this is showing, this person is 79% time in range and actually only spending, total 3% of the time low. And even the coefficient of variation is only 33 and the GMI is 6.6. So for all intents and purposes, this is a person that is meeting all of those targets. But I would still go through the data model and have that conversation because this individual may want to achieve tighter targets. So even though they're meeting the recommendations, maybe this person really wants to hone in and, eliminate some of the higher readings that are happening sometimes, especially in the evening time. And so I would just say, just because a person's already meeting that one target doesn't mean that we can't continue that conversation and see what we can do to improve it even more. This is one of my favorite reports. This is actually in a Libre view. And the reason I like this is because it's that snapshot to assess hypoglycemia. And I like this example because the AGP is at the top of this report. And when I look at that AGP, I see a person that's spending a lot of time in hyperglycemia. The average glucose is 259. And so my first thought is not that I have to really worry about hypoglycemia with this person. I just want to really bring that whole curve down. But then I pull up this report and it's showing me very clearly there are 8 low glucose events over this 14-day period, and they're all happening pretty much, between 4 and 6 p.m. Wow, that's super useful because now I can make sure we tweak things so there's not hypoglycemia at that time, but also work to get the rest of that curve down. Gluco also has a lot of integrated reports because it's able to pair with different insulin pumps and CGM systems. And so you can be looking at both of those things in one report. And so, you know, we can have different types of reporting options. This patient here is actually pregnant. So that's where you see the 63 to 140. You can see that this person's spending 63% of the time in that target. And then the image on the left is actually an example of kind of a crunched up day by day. And we can see that there's certainly, you know, a lot of peaks, a lot of hyperglycemia happening you know, at certain times, especially it seems like, you know, more towards the evening. And I like this kind of hour by hour report that's available that's showing at each different hour how much glucose is in target, is in range, how much is above range, and then any hypoglycemia. So I can really hone in on the fact that it seems like there are some higher glucose readings, especially happening between 8 p.m. and midnight, that there may be some opportunity for improvement. And then, you know, there is some hypoglycemia that's happening throughout the day. And so this is really a stepping stone for that discussion. In addition, one of the things I like about Gluco is just that it can link up with with Apple Health and everything. So you can even get things like steps and other app information in there. And then of course we can see the basal bolus breakdown of here. This person's got 43% as basal and 57% as bolus insulin. Another reporting option that I like are, you know, comparing data and being able to compare 2 weeks apart. And so this is very useful if you've made changes and you want to see the effects of those changes. So like this is an example of a patient I worked with, and you can see on the left, you know, an 8.2% GMI, 42% time in range. And then after making some adjustments to the insulin dosing, that the GMI came down to 7.6% and time in range improved to 51%. Comparing day to day. So this is actually one of my favorite things to do. And when I download data, I really like the AGP report, because the AGP report will show the AGP, so your ambulatory glucose profile. It will show you your key metrics, including time in range, and it will also show you the most recent 14 days. So I like going through that day by day, and I'll basically take the 5-step data system and, you know, first downloading the data and orienting the person to it, assessing safety. So in this example, Sunday, June 25th, we can see that there was hypoglycemia happening there. So that's the first thing I would ask the patient about, just, you know, what happened there, and addressing any potential safety concerns, or if we can figure out what led to the hypoglycemia, hopefully, you know, prevent that from happening next time. But then what I'm actually going to do then is I'm going to do the time in range and focus on what's working well. So in this image here, if you look at Monday, June 26th, 90% time in range. So I'd say, let's have a discussion about that. What did you eat for breakfast? What did you eat for lunch? You know, what kind of physical activity did you get that day? What was going on? Did you have any stressors? And let's work to do more of that, because, right, being 90% in range is awesome. And so the idea being, let's try to focus on that versus instead, you know, I could narrow in and talk more about Sunday and what led to the high. But, you know, it's, I think, a lot more empowering to focus on what's working well. And then after that, if the person wants to focus on areas to improve, we can. But if not, a lot of the learning happens just from trying to replicate what's working well and coming up with an action plan from that. So I want to share with you this example. This is Jeff, who's wearing a Medtronic 670G, so a hybrid closed loop pump. And I think this is a good example of why data requires a discussion with the person with diabetes, or I should say it is much more enhanced when you can have that discussion. So if you look at the report here, you know, this is a little unusual because he's wearing one of these hybrid closed loop systems, which is really supposed to auto adjust insulin for him. And so it's a little bit surprising that he's spending 20% of the time in hypoglycemia, right? He does have 75% time in range, but that's a little more hypoglycemia than we would want for anybody. So, we look at this and we could initially just look at this data and say, like this is just really strange. Like maybe his pump is broken, or, or maybe, maybe the carb ratios are too aggressive and we need to back off on that, right? So those would be reasonable things to think. But go ahead, take a closer look, right? And then look at the carbs that he entered. So he entered 403 grams on average, plus or minus 159. So, right? So that sounds like a lot. So, I mean, just from seeing that, right, I kind of am thinking, like, does he know how to count carbohydrates, or is something going on where he's wanting to be this low? So that's where the discussion is so important, because you need to figure out, well, what is the issue? Is the issue he doesn't know how to carb count? Is he just, we know some patients just think they are supposed to enter 50 grams each time or 100 grams each time. And if the issue is that he just wants it to be lower, why is that? So that's where the discussion is just so important and so valuable. I want to leave you with this example. So this is an example of someone who's wearing someone who's using Omnipod and Dexcom and then using Gluco to download the data. And so that's exactly what we've done. We've downloaded the data, and this is the spaghetti graph. And so I think there's a lot of spaghetti here, right? There's not a ton of really obvious patterns, right? There's just a lot of lines going around. So let's take a deeper look at this, right? So 44% time in range. There's about 3% of the time spent low, and then the rest of the time is spent higher, above 180. When we look at that coefficient of variation, it's 39.4. So what that means is that there is a lot of variability, more than we'd like, more extremes from high and low glucose. And then I've got the pump data here. I can see that 30% is given as basal and 70% as bolus. And, the person's not overriding the pump settings very often at all, only 1.3% of the time. So shouldn't be a major issue. And then about 290 grams of carbs entered per day. And the CGM is almost 91% active. So this is where, first I've downloaded the data and explained, and I would explain to Julie, there's a good amount of variability. So let's try to figure out what's happening. I'm going to assess the safety. So we're going to talk about, some of these lows that are happening overnight can be very concerning. And so we have a discussion about that. It's kind of funny, all my examples, I feel like I'm using our pregnancy, but as it turns out, Julie is breastfeeding. And so that was leading to some of the lows overnight that were happening and allowed us to come up with some strategies to prevent the hypoglycemia from happening overnight. Now, next, we want to try to replicate the positive, right? So we try to focus. Julie didn't have a ton of days per se that had, huge amounts of time in range, but we can still focus on areas where time in range was higher. And so, we look at the time on the top, and that particular night, a correction dose, a dosing for carbs and with correction, was able to bring the glucose down and was relatively steady overnight. And so that was a conversation that, we were able to talk about and kind of what led up to that and how we can do a little bit more of that and some strategies to prevent the hypoglycemia again from happening. And then areas to improve. So we figured out that, that it seemed like the current boluses just aren't working well enough. Certainly the correction doses weren't working enough to bring the glucose down. And so there is a lot of variability in terms of, glucose going higher, and then sometimes perhaps bolusing a little bit too much and leading to it to coming down too much. So we worked on a plan to actually adjust the settings. And so that's where the action plan comes in, right? We've got the basal rates here, the insulin to carbohydrate ratios here, and we worked together on strategies to really optimize those. A couple of the basal rates, during the day, we actually went up on and increased those. And we tweaked the carb ratios a little bit. And then we followed up again in a couple weeks. Now, that being said, that it can be time consuming, right? To go through all of that data and to figure out all those different things. So that's where something like DreamEd Advisor Pro is like a miracle worker, right? So it can take that data, all that Omnipod data and the CGM data, and use a very sophisticated algorithm to come up with the best recommendations. So I'm not sitting here like, like what? I can still have, and I still should have, a meaningful conversation with the person. But it takes that and it quickly identifies the settings in the patterns of what's happening and gives recommendations for what could those settings be to tweak it. And then I as a clinician can choose if I want to accept all those settings, or maybe through my discussion, we say, oh, I like all these settings, but maybe the overnight one, we'll still keep that basal just a little bit lower because of the breastfeeding and possibly the unpredictable hypoglycemia. So with all of that, I want to leave you with a few key takeaways. One is just that there are a lot of technology options, which is very exciting, but we want to make sure that we're taking the time to individualize it for our patients. We know that there are barriers to data downloads, but there's also a lot of solutions, and the reports have been much simplified, and so it's just about kind of finding the right reports and the right conversation tool to have a meaningful conversation with the patient and to use that data to help their outcomes. We have that data model, which really helps with that rich discussion and can empower people with diabetes by focusing on what's working well instead of nitpicking the things that maybe aren't working as well. And then we have more sophisticated technology now, like DreamEd Advisor Pro, which can really make that data interpretation piece so much easier and allow the healthcare team to focus on the individual. So with that, I want to thank you for watching this, and there's my email. So if you have any questions or need anything, feel free to reach out. Have a great day.